I wanted to continue today with the white fragility. It gets harder at times. I know this chapter was particularly hard, and I'm only going to do the first part of it, chapter 4. She starts off with a quote today, and she said, this is a person of color, a quote from a person of color. And she says, I don't really want you to understand me better. I want you to understand yourself. In fact, your survival has never depended on your knowledge of white culture. It's required your ignorance. And what she's saying is that we're trying to understand a little more about the culture we're born into, the air we breathe, the life that we lead. So she says the underlying foundation of white fragility is being white, because as the dominant culture, it never gets accounted for as part of who we are. Whereas someone of color, someone from an Hispanic or African American or any other culture that is not the dominant culture, everything they are is related to and affected by their race. Whereas we tend to, in the white culture, live without consideration of our race, and therefore it becomes invisible to us. This is shared virtually by all white people in a dominantly white culture. So she's speaking now, and this is a white author. I was born into a culture where racially I was the dominant, so therefore it was never an issue about race for me. I was born in a hospital because that's what white people do, because my parents were white. The instructors that I worked under were mostly white. Everybody in my class was predominantly white. And most people depicted in ads and in television shows and in any other depictions of the politicians, the athletes, the media stars were predominantly white. And this was a part of the culture I grew up in. White mothers, white fathers. When you took a parenting class, it was based on white racial identity because that was the dominant race of the culture. So in all likelihood, white was everywhere and therefore became invisible to us. Did not have to worry about how they would be treated. Didn't have to fear or consider themselves outsiders or different whatsoever. They received a higher caliber of care than would people of color. And that's an interesting concept that we're beginning to understand, that even when it came to health care, there were differences in the way a white person would be treated in a white culture, a white dominant culture, than a person of color would be treated in the same healthcare situation. It's an interesting declaration that's made there that I wasn't aware of until recently. The people then who cleaned the hospital room, who did the laundry, and who cooked, the servant class that I predominantly saw in my growing up, in my culture, were people of color. So that's the context that she's trying to kind of set for us. And then she begins this long string of I belong. I belong in this culture. I have never felt an outsider in this culture. I've never been exiled from this culture. I belong when I turn on the TV. I belong when I look at the magazine racks. I belong racially. I belong when I look at my teachers, my counselors, my classmates. I belong when I learn about the history, when I'm shown heroes and heroines, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Amelia Earhart, Susan B. Anthony, John Glenn, Sally Ride. These are people that are my people. I belong when I look through textbooks and pictures on my classroom walls. I belong when I speak to my children's teachers, camp counselors, when I consult with doctors and dentists. All the representations, she says, are overwhelmingly white. I belong in my culture because my culture dominates. So my experience of belonging is so natural, I don't have to think about it. That's the challenge. So as I walked down the slope towards the picnic party, she said she had this experience. She noticed two parties going on side by side, and one of them was primarily white people, the other one primarily black people, and for a moment she wasn't sure where she was supposed to be at that moment. She had to choose which party was her friend, the friend's party she was attending. And for that moment then, she suddenly had to deal with racial self-awareness. It was the first time she remembers an experience of not belonging racially if she walked into one of the parties as opposed to the other. And she feels like, I should avoid situations in which I might be a racial minority. As a white person, I will be seen as racially not belonging there. So that was the first time she realized, oh yeah, I'm white. Because she lives in a culture dominated by whiteness, she doesn't think about it, not like a person of color thinks about it every day of their life. So she doesn't carry the psychic weight of race, she says. If she goes through a neighborhood, and I thought about this just yesterday, I went walking in a very nice neighborhood, and I had no qualms that I would be considered an outsider here. I look like the majority of the people who live in this neighborhood, in this division of grouping of peoples. And I remember a time once when my wife and I were taking a walk, and we made a left turn and went into a neighborhood that was predominantly other than us. And it was one of my uncomfortable moments because someone actually yelled at me, "You don't belong in this neighborhood." Two white people walking in that neighborhood stood out. And I realized that I'm dealing with this awful challenge of being a racial minority for me, one of the first times in my whole life. So if I go to a black tie event or a fancy encounter, a party, a fundraiser, whatever, I never think that they're going to mistake me for the help. When a black man approaches me at a school, they wonder if you're going to consider them the principal or not, even if they are legitimately the principal. Career choices have always been open to me, all of them, when I apply for a job, she says. Although I will encounter token persons of color within these communities, they are not the dominant racial mix in the culture. So once hired, I don't have to deal with thoughts of, I got this job because I am white. Some sort of affirmation that because there's a hiring preference. She can find, she says, validation at every aspect of her student life, of her professional life, of her personal life as a mother, as a career person. In every aspect of it, whiteness has psychological advantage that translate into material returns for her. So while I'm aware that race has been used unfairly against people of color, I haven't been taught to see this problem as my responsibility. I have freedom from responsibility because of the dominance of my race in the culture in which I live. Except for one notable exception. She's not male. And she points out the fact that there is a male preference, a dominance in our culture that kept her as a female she had to deal with. So she came to taste a little bit of what it was like to struggle in a culture of dominance where she was the minority. She talks about freedom of movement, the freedom to move in virtually every space. I doubt seriously two men in a pickup truck would run me down and hold a gun on me if I was walking through their neighborhood, or doing what I know I would have done as well. If there was a house under construction, I would have felt free to walk through that house and look at what it was being built, what materials they were using, and not be accused of being a burglar. She talks about a friend of color of hers, and they were going to make a fun trip. And she suggested that they go to a place in a northern Idaho, she said. And her friend said, why in the world would I want to go on a vacation in northern Idaho? And she talked about these beautiful places. For her, as a white person, never thought about the racial context of that place. But it turns out the Aryan Nation was building a compound near Hayden Lake in northern Idaho. Not all the people who live in the area are avowed white nationalists, no, but it's very strongly influenced in that particular area. And one of the things I want to say as a Southerner is this is not a Southern problem. This is an American problem. We've got to think about it more in national terms. Obviously, when they talked about Juneteenth as the day that Texas finally had their slaves liberated, they make the point that that was only slaves in the South. There was still slavery going on up north as well, and those slaves were the last to be freed. So it's not something we can make a North and South thing where we're bearing the brunt of it. It's everywhere. When they desegregated schools, one of the things that shocked me were all the riots that went on in Boston. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this segregation has already occurred down here to a point, but up there, they were still having riots over it. So it's one of the interesting things as we look to whiteness versus people of color. It's dominant in the United States. It's not just a Southern problem. So my race, she says, was held up as the norm for humanity. I remember a comment my friends used to say to me when I would do something magnanimous, something generous or whatever, and they'd say, well, that's awfully white of you. And that phrase was a comment. It was a put down to me because they were making fun of me for thinking I was being generous. But it was a comment that we freely used amongst my peer group. So whites are just people. Everyone else is minority. Adult literature, how consistently the race of the characters of colors are named. But obviously they don't point out that such and such was a white person. It was assumed they were white unless you said they were Asian, they were African American, they were of some other race other than white. So, use an example from school, she said, consider the writers we were expected to read. Hemingway, Steinbeck, Dickens, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, William Shakespeare. These represented the universal human experience. And we have to accept the fact these were white. Multicultural Authors Week, we had Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and some other writers, but they were not just writers. They were specifically identified as black writers. See the difference? So reinforcing the idea of whites as just human and people of color as particular racialized humans. So not having an agenda or any particular perspective is what the white writers were considered to have. But they don't know. They don't. They have a white perspective because they live in the white dominant culture. Any representation of human was based on white people norms and white people images. Flesh-colored makeup, standard emojis, depictions of Adam and Eve in most paintings you find, even Jesus and Mary. Educational models of the human body, white skin, blue eyes. So these are a trait that if you just look, you'll see it there. But sometimes it has to be pointed out to us. Whiteness is naturally superior if the white culture dominates. And that's what we're working with here. So theorists represent human development as if it was universal. But it's not human, it's not universal. It's based on white culture, white dominance in this area. So then she goes on to talk a bit about white solidarity. It's the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage. Now this is controversial because when I read this, I was like, I don't feel this way. I don't try to stand up for or fight for racial superiority. She calls it white racial bonding. affirm a common stance on race-related issues. And basically what she's saying is that we have a silence that goes on in the white dominant culture, that we don't want to cause trouble amongst our white colleagues. There's a lot of pressure, and a lot of it is inferenced pressure. It's not overt. It's very under the surface, as we've talked about before, part of that iceberg underneath. Silence about anything that exposes our advantage. We're not to speak up about it. Everyone cringes at a party where someone says, Uncle Bob, she says, makes the racially offensive joke. We might cringe, but we won't speak out because we don't want to ruin the dinner. We don't want our mother or someone else to pull us aside and say, you're not the PC police. Lighten up. Let this go. Don't make an issue out of it. Speaking up about racism amongst a racial dominant group would ruin the ambiance. It would break white solidarity. There's social coercion that puts pressure on us not to speak up about these things, and we've tolerated it for a long, long time. That's why my former DS said that he wasn't going to be silent anymore. If he hears this kind of thing, then he was going to speak up about it in his family. And that's going to be a place where all of us would find a great pushback as we try to deal with this. I was in a conversation with family members about this very kind of thing, about race, intermarriage, that kind of thing. And one of my comments was, well, wait a minute, as a Christian, doesn't that look like the kingdom of God? To be diverse and to include all people. And that is a stumbling block for Christian communities if we are indeed racially dominant as white, that we understand that that's not God's will. That's not God's kingdom. And so that's a hard place to stand when you're discussing this with family. So being seen as fun, cooperative, and a team player is part of the pressure we experience if we live in a white dominant culture, if we are white. So she says, at least I'm not the one that made the joke. I just am not going to, cause a riff about it. Well, people of color certainly experience white solidarity as racism. When we say, I'm not racist, well, did you speak up? Did you make a stink at Thanksgiving? Those kinds of things. Do you speak of the good old days when times were simpler, when we didn't talk about these kinds of things, when all of this was not noticed, not paid attention to, and my dominance was allowed to just go on as normal? That's the part of the world that we're experiencing this shift. And I gotta say, as a white person, it's uncomfortable. It's scary to think, what happens if I'm the minority? What happens to me and my children and my grandchildren? And we begin to get fearful, and fear is the enemy. We were not given a spirit of fear, but a spirit of truth and righteousness. And therefore, we have to be careful. We have seen in our culture a dominance that has brought with it some evil that goes along with it. Of course, my computer's failing me. Let me see if I can get into this. There's a white working class resentment now that we feel like certain people are getting advantages that our children won't get, or certain scholarships that our kids won't get because they were a minority. It was a minority gift to them. Whereas on the other side, the presentations that they make are that their children have to work twice as hard, do twice as good, make twice the grades, have to really excel just to get a normal advantage, a normal opportunity that our children would normally expect. All right, to finish this up, let me say this. She talks really about the white elite and those of us in the middle class, which is being shrunk, by the way, being pressured down. I'm one of those people that really believe the middle class is the saving grace of America. We need middle class more than we need anything else. As the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, America will crumble from the inside due to this classism. And guess how that gets dominated? It gets dominated by the 1%, the upper percent. And it just amazes me that those of us who, quote, work for a living, and you got to understand, it's the workers that are seen to be now in this pandemic as the, what do we call them? The essential workers, yes. The people who stock our grocery shelves, who deliver our packages, who run the trucks in America to carry the goods from here to there. And these people have long been abused by our the lack of morality in our capitalist system, where we just pay them the minimum we need to pay them. Our healthcare workers are in this. Our teachers are in this minority. And the 1% seems to just enjoy all of us as the servant class. And let me tell you, they don't care what color we are as long as we are working for them. So here's some statistics for us middle class people to think about as we look at who the true oppressors are in our society. The white elite. The richest 1% owns more wealth than the rest of the planet owns. And this is 2015 statistics. 8 men own the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world. Half the world. We lump them all together, and the wealth of the 8 men own more of it. The income of the poorest 10% of people has increased by less than $3 a year between 1988 and 2011. As the richest 1%, they've increased 182 times as much. In other words, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is shrinking, and that spells doom for the United States, for our culture, for our nation. We need to go back to the middle class. We need to grow it. We need to expand it. And it's happening at the top. And that's one of the things that we've got to worry about. Bloomberg's daily rankings of the world's 500 richest people. The world's wealthiest 3, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos. 2 out of the 3, I think, are genuinely philanthropic. But still, they're the white American men. White American men have the total net worths of 85 billion, 79 billion, 73 billion, and these are old figures. By comparison, in 2015, gross domestic product of Sri Lanka was only 82 billion. That's an entire country compared to this one person. And it gets complicated. I don't want to get lost in all the figures, but of the world's 10 richest people, 9 are white men. In the world's biggest corporations together, it says that that's part of our problem. In the U.S., over the past 30 years, the growth in the incomes of the bottom 50% has been 0. And the incomes of the top 1% have grown by 300%. The rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is getting squeezed out. Then she talks a bit about white flight. I've already mentioned that. The cities to the suburbs. The integration of schools has been an issue that we fought against and worry about. Where are the best schools? Where are the white schools? And we worry about how to fix that, how to make that better. We've got to admit it's a problem. The practice of our lives as a white collective has rarely been in alignment with the values that we Americans profess. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, your huddled masses seeking for shelter and safety, and bring them here to America. That's what the Statue of Liberty says. And yet we act and set up a culture and set up an economy that works opposite. We must reverse this, or we're going to find out when it's too late that we no longer have the power. And part of the problem is with our politics is that it takes money to buy influence. And we have to work on that. So we've got some serious issues to deal with to make America strong. White racial innocence is that's where I'm going to start next. That's the end of part 1 of chapter 4. So it's an interesting concept. I want to deal with classism as much as I want to deal with racism. But in order to do that, we're going to have to invite and encourage and make it possible for the middle class to grow again. And that's going to be growing it with all people, not just white people. All right. That's what the pages say today. Be good. God bless you. And I will see you soon. Be sure to be